In 1945, the world emerged from the nightmare of World War II. In Europe, cities were reduced to rubble, and people were exhausted after years of relentless bombing. Yet, amidst the ruins, a new kind of war had begun, a race for technological and intellectual supremacy, particularly in the fields of rocketry and aerospace. Among the priceless treasures sought by the Allied forces were not gold or art, but the minds of German scientists, those who had developed the most advanced weapon of the era, the V-2 rocket. Designed by Wernher von Braun and the Peenem-ND team, the V-2 was the first weapon in human history to breach the atmosphere, only to plummet back to Earth at supersonic speeds, spreading terror in London and Antwerp. A secret plan. In Washington, as the war ended, the U.S. military realized that if they didn't act swiftly, the Soviet Union would claim the scientific bounty. Thus, a covert operation codenamed Operation Paperclip was born. Its goal, to bring as many German scientists to the US as possible, regardless of their past. The name Paperclip came from a mundane detail. The files of scientists with ties to the Nazi regime were often marked with a paperclip to facilitate the cleaning of their records before immigration. In other words, many who had been Nazi party members or were linked to forced labor camps had their pasts whitewashed to serve America's strategic interests. Initially, the plan sparked fierce controversy. Many Americans could not stomach the idea of welcoming former Nazis into their country. However, fear of the Soviet Union ultimately prevailed. President Truman, after much deliberation, approved the operation with the condition that only those without direct ties to war crimes be selected. In practice, this condition was often relaxed to meet military needs. The strange journey of German minds. By late 1945, hundreds of German scientists, engineers, and experts, many of whom were key figures in the V-2 program, were secretly brought to the U.S. They were initially stationed at Fort Bliss, Texas, and White Sands Proving Ground, New Mexico, where they worked under strict supervision. The scene was ironic. Men who once wore Nazi uniforms now stood in the American desert under the Stars and Stripes flag. Many had never set foot in the U.S. before. To them, America was a distant enemy, a wealthy but crude nation. Now serialized, they were working for their former foe. Some accounts reveal that the German engineers initially scoffed at the American rocket program. They viewed their young American counterparts as novices, lacking experience, while the Germans had years of real-world testing with the V-2. During technical meetings, they smirked at the designs presented by the Americans. Scientist Ernst Stuhlinger later recalled, "We thought the Americans had money but no imagination. We didn't believe they could catch up to the technology Germany had achieved during the war." The Americans' wariness. The Americans were equally guarded. Military officers eyed the German scientists with suspicion. The American public was outraged when they learned the government was giving preferential treatment to former Hitler loyalists. Even American engineers working alongside them felt insulted. Why did their nation, with its vast scientific and technological resources, need to rely on Germans? During early tests at White Sands, the atmosphere was tense. The Americans were eager to learn quickly, but the Germans were arrogant, speaking in a condescending tone. They often boasted, "We launched thousands of V-2s at England. You've got nothing yet." Despite this, the Americans remained patient. They knew that by tapping into this knowledge, they could gain a strategic weapon not just for military purposes, but also for space exploration ambitions. The first lessons. Under von Braun's guidance, the U.S. began assembling and testing V-2 rockets brought from Germany. Each launch was a heart-pounding lesson. Many rockets exploded mid-air or crashed into the desert like massive pillars of fire. The Americans were enthusiastic, seeing each failure as a learning opportunity. The Germans, meanwhile, smirked and grumbled, watching their masterpiece being clumsily replicated. One German engineer once remarked, "If this were Peenem-ND, we'd have done it 10 times better." Gradually, however, both sides learned to collaborate. The Americans brought immense resources, funding, materials, and modern laboratories. The Germans provided foundational knowledge in engines, aerodynamics, and flight control. The two pieces slowly fit together, despite initial clashes. a new chapter begins. Looking back, Operation Paperclip was more than a scientific recruitment drive. It opened a new chapter in human history. From those early days at Fort Bliss and White Sands, the German scientists laid the groundwork for what would become the U.S. space program. At the time, few could foresee the future. To the German scientists, they were merely helping the U.S. catch up to what Germany had already achieved. They saw their work as a continuation, nothing more. Deep down, many believed the U.S. would never surpass the VTE's achievements. Little did they know that one day, in the very nation they once mocked, they would witness something that even they could not believe with their own eyes. Early days of conflict. After arriving in the U.S., most German scientists were sent to Fort Bliss, Texas, and White Sands Proving Ground, New Mexico. These were alien landscapes, vast deserts, scorching sun, and sparsely populated towns. To men accustomed to working in the sophisticated facilities of Penem-ND on the Baltic coast, where the V2 was born, this felt like a demotion. In those first weeks, many Germans openly expressed skepticism, even mocking their new work environment. They joked among themselves, "Americans think they can build rockets in a desert? They don't even have a proper workshop. At Penem-ND, we had coastal test ranges, dedicated railways, and an army of engineers. Here, just young soldiers and a few rundown warehouses." To them, America, though wealthy, lacked the refinement and scientific discipline Germany once had. Tense technical meetings. When they began working with American engineers, cultural and professional differences became glaring. The Germans were accustomed to a focused, hierarchical work style, valuing top-down master designs. In contrast, the young American engineers were more flexible, favoring rapid experimentation and learning from mistakes. In many meetings, the Germans scrutinized and ridiculed the Americans' preliminary designs. "You call this a rocket? It's just a steel tube with an engine attached. We were breaking the atmosphere in 1944. You're still struggling with the first few kilometers." Such remarks infuriated American engineers, but they held back, knowing the military needed the Germans' expertise. The V2's long shadow. It was hard to deny. The V2 was a technical marvel. Over 14 meters long, weighing 12 tons, carrying a near 1-ton warhead, it flew at supersonic speeds and reached altitudes exceeding 80 kilometers beyond the atmosphere. With the V2, Germany had terrified the world. Thus, the German engineers saw the V2 as the gold standard. They constantly referenced its success in debates, reinforcing their superiority. "Have you ever built a liquid-fueled engine with 25 tons of thrust? Germany did that 3 years ago." To them, American efforts were merely relearning old lessons. They were certain it would take decades for the U.S. to match Germany's wartime achievements. The American response. The American engineers and officers, initially angered, grew more determined. They knew they were being belittled, but saw it as motivation to prove their worth. Some American engineers wrote in their journals, "They treat us like students. Maybe we are learning, but one day, they'll learn from us. We have resources Germany never had. Let them laugh now. We'll show them." This tension became an unspoken competition. The Americans wanted to prove themselves, while the Germans sought to maintain their role as trailblazers. The first stumbles. At White Sands, the U.S. began test launching V2s brought from Europe. Many tests failed spectacularly. Rockets exploded on the pad or crashed seconds after launch. Each time, the Germans shook their heads, whispering in their native tongue and smirking. But the Americans saw it differently. Failure was data. Each explosion yielded hundreds of pages of reports, lessons learned, and adjustments made. This contrasted with the Germans' no mistakes allowed approach. Gradually, the Americans improved. They learned faster than expected, which began to unsettle some German scientists, though they wouldn't admit it openly. Everyday life. A divide hard to bridge. Outside the labs, cultural differences were stark. German families lived in separate quarters, speaking German and eating German food, rarely integrating with the American community. In bars or canteens, Heated debate sometimes erupted. One American officer recalled, "They called our beer watery. They mocked burgers and hot dogs as peasant food. Even our coffee was too weak for them." This arrogance fueled the Americans' desire to prove that their nation could do more than make hamburgers, it could conquer space. Glimmers of cooperation. Despite the tension, some younger German engineers grew intrigued by the American environment. They admired the Americans' willingness to experiment, fail, and work at a remarkable pace. Some admitted that, with enough resources, the U.S. could go far. Conversely, some American engineers began respecting the Germans' expertise. They realized that, despite their arrogance, von Braun's team possessed knowledge the U.S. lacked. Cooperation, however reluctant, began to take shape. The start of a bigger race. As the Cold War intensified, both the US and the Soviet Union recognized that rockets were not just weapons, but symbols of national power. The Americans couldn't afford to let the Soviets outpace them or to keep being mocked by the Germans. The conflicts, smirks, and early failures were merely the prelude to a long journey. From those days of being belittled, the Americans began nurturing a determination to achieve something unimaginable, a feat that would stun the world, including the German scientists who once scoffed at them. From desert to laboratory. In the late 1940s, at New Mexico's deserts, the U.S. was still grappling with the aging V-2 rockets brought from Europe. Most were damaged, spare parts were scarce, and reassembling them felt like solving a giant puzzle. Under the reluctant guidance of German scientists, the Americans studied every detail: engines, combustion chambers, guidance systems. Each test was a lesson. Some rockets exploded seconds after launch, creating fireballs in the desert sky. American engineers called these expensive but useful events. The Germans shook their heads, repeating, "At Penum ND, we did better." Yet, as tests continued, the Americans made steady progress. They moved beyond relying solely on V-2 blueprints, experimenting with new combustion chambers, materials, and most importantly new ways of thinking that diverged from the Germans' approach. Redstone, the first step. By the early 1950s, under von Braun's leadership, the U.S. developed the Redstone rocket. A direct descendant of the V-2, it was far more powerful, standing 21 meters tall, capable of carrying nuclear warheads, and significantly more reliable. Initially, the Germans mocked it. Redstone is just a stretched V-2, nothing new. But they also had to admit the Americans learned quickly. In just a few years, the US went from having no rocket program to possessing a strategic weapon. Redstone wasn't just a military tool. It later launched the first American, Alan Shepard, into space in 1961, a turning point even the Germans couldn't foresee at the time. The race turns. The Soviets enter. While the US focused on Redstone, the Soviet Union quietly accelerated its efforts. They too had captured German scientists, but more crucially, they invested heavily in homegrown rocket development. Sergei Korolev, the Soviet Union's chief designer, led the Ir-7 rocket program, a massive rocket with lifting capacity far beyond anything the US or Germany had built. On October 4, 1957, the world was stunned. The Soviet Union successfully launched Sputnik 1, the first artificial satellite, the Sputnik shock. As Sputnik orbited Earth, emitting its simple beep-beep signal, America was in shock. The press dubbed it a space bomb. The public feared that if the Soviets could launch a satellite, they could also deliver nuclear missiles anywhere in the US. At bases and labs, the German scientists were equally stunned. They had mocked American engineers as slow and inexperienced, but now, the Soviets had outpaced them all. Some Germans whispered, "We didn't think they could do this so quickly. The Ir-7 surpasses even Redstone." It'll take the Americans years to catch up. For the first time, the German scientists felt genuine concern. They realized the US was running out of time. If they didn't accelerate, America would lag far behind the Soviets. America's response. Sputnik triggered the Sputnik crisis. In the US Congress held urgent hearings, the media criticized the government for sleeping, and citizens bought telescopes to track the Soviet satellite in the sky. the Eisenhower administration reacted swiftly, established NASA in 1958, replacing the outdated knocker, massively increased funding for scientific research and education, especially in math, physics, and engineering, urged von Braun's team to accelerate rocket development to compete. For the Americans once mocked as novices, this was a golden opportunity. They no longer wanted to be the German students, they wanted to lead. Explorer 1. The first retort. Just 4 months after Sputnik, on January 31, 1958, the U.S. launched Explorer 1, its first satellite, using the Juno I rocket, a Redstone variant. Though small, Explorer 1 proved America could join the space race. In the control room, American engineers wept with joy. They recalled years of being mocked and underestimated, and now they had proven their worth. The German scientists, who once dismissed Redstone as a V2 knockoff, had to acknowledge that America's persistence and resources were turning child's play into real achievement. A shift in German attitudes. After Sputnik and Explorer 1, the atmosphere in U.S. labs changed noticeably. The Germans could no longer mock so easily. They saw that the Americans weren't just copying, they were innovating in their own way. Some German engineers admitted they work differently, less disciplined, more experimental, but with surprising results. We underestimated them. Yet, deep down, many Germans still believed that grand dreams like landing on the moon were too far-fetched for their lifetime. They saw it as science fiction, but the Americans were different. For the Americans, Sputnik was a slap in the face, but also a wake-up call. It fueled their determination not just to catch up with the Soviets, but to lead. From 1958 onward, every rocket, satellite, and research program carried this ambition. That resolve would lead to one of humanity's greatest achievements, one that would leave the world, including the once arrogant German scientists, in awe. After the Sputnik shock, the U.S. entered an unprecedented period of intensity. Congress boosted defense and research budgets to record levels. In 1958, President Dwight D. Eisenhower signed the creation of NASA National Aeronautics and Space Administration, a pivotal move that transformed U.S. rocketry from a mocked endeavor to a springboard for future triumphs. From Redstone to Jupiter, growing pains. The early rockets developed with German involvement, like Redstone and Jupiter, were initially just improved V/S. The German experts scoffed at how long it took the Americans to master details they had perfected by 1944. "We did this at Penum ND with far fewer resources," one engineer recalled, but they soon noticed a difference. The Americans didn't just copy, they innovated. From Redstone to Jupiter, growing pains. The early rockets developed with German involvement, like Redstone and Jupiter, were initially just improved V/S. The German experts scoffed at how long it took the Americans to master details they had perfected by 1944. "We did this at Penum ND with far fewer resources," one engineer recalled, but they soon noticed a difference. The Americans didn't just copy, they innovated. While von Braun's team worked at Redstone Arsenal in Alabama, another group of American engineers, with indirect German support, developed the Atlas rocket. Atlas became America's first ICBM, and later launched John Glenn, the first American to orbit Earth, in 1962. Watching Atlas in action, many German engineers grew uneasy. This rocket was longer, more powerful, and far more complex than the V2. The Americans were no longer clumsy students, they were forging their own path. Some Germans admitted that while they had mocked the clunky American designs, it was that boldness that unlocked potential far beyond anything they had imagined during the Nazi era. The race with the Soviet Union. The Soviets continued to lead with stunning achievements. Yuri Gagarin became the first human in space in 1961, shocking the world. President John F. Kennedy responded with his famous declaration to Congress, "We choose to go to the moon, not because it is easy, but because it is hard." This was more than a political promise, it was a call to mobilize America's technological, industrial, and scientific might to make the dream a reality. The German scientists, who once thought landing on the moon was unthinkable in the 20th century, now saw the US government pour everything into that goal. Many who had scoffed at the idea were now forced to participate, and some felt dwarfed by the audacity of the vision, a strange synergy, German minds and American might. Von Braun and his team became central to the Apollo program. They designed the Saturn rocket series starting with Saturn I, then Saturn IB, and finally Saturn V. Here, technical cultures blended. The Germans brought foundational knowledge of rocket engines and structures. The Americans contributed industrial might, large-scale project management, and abundant funding. Initially, some Germans remained arrogant, believing the Americans would achieve nothing without them. But as time passed, they were stunned to see thousands of young American engineers from MIT, Caltech, and Princeton quickly catch up and even surpass their knowledge. A former German engineer recalled, "We thought we were the masters, but then we saw thousands of young Americans working day and night with incredible optimism and discipline. That's when we knew the game had changed." Apollo 8 and a leap in spirit. In 1968, when Apollo 8 successfully orbited the moon and returned safely, many German scientists were speechless watching the broadcast. They recalled their days at Phnom ND, when they only dared to dream of flights a few hundred kilometers away. Now, the Americans had surpassed their vision, and they were part of it. Some felt pride, others conflicted, but all had to admit they were wrong to mock their American colleagues. Beyond weapons. Most importantly, American rockets were no longer just weapons. They became tools to explore space, reshaping the purpose of rocketry. For many German engineers who had worked for the Nazi regime, this was a cultural shock. They had built V2s to destroy London. Now, they saw their technology used to pursue humanity's loftiest dreams. On July 16, 1969, millions worldwide watched as the Saturn V, the largest rocket ever built, launched from Kennedy Space Center. Amid roaring engines, white smoke, and towering flames, the 110-meter metal giant soared into Florida's sky, carrying 3 astronauts, Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and Michael Collins. Saturn V, a machine beyond imagination. Saturn V was the culmination of over 400,000 engineers, scientists, and workers. It generated over 7.5 million pounds of thrust, 10 times that of the V2, once considered a technological marvel by Nazi Germany. The German engineers who designed the V2 initially doubted such a rocket could work. They recalled the 1940s, when keeping a V2 stable for a few minutes was a feat. Yet Saturn V was not only stable, it carried over 45 tons of equipment and humans to lunar orbit. In that moment, the world held its breath. The German engineers, who once mocked the idea of lunar landings, were stunned. Some shed tears, others gripped the hands of their American colleagues. They knew they were witnessing not just a technical triumph, but a transcendence of their past. A change within. For many German scientists, Apollo 11 held profound meaning. They had once used their intellect to create weapons of destruction. Now, they contributed to a mission that brought humanity closer to the stars. One engineer from von Braun's team later wrote, "Watching Armstrong walk on the moon, I felt guilt and pride at once. Guilt for what I did during the war. Pride that science was finally used for a noble purpose." Many Germans, who had once belittled their American colleagues, now admitted that America's collective strength, relentless creativity, and optimism made the dream reality. Couldn't believe their eyes. They had mocked America's bulky designs. They had laughed at repeated test failures. But now, watching Saturn V launch and Apollo 11 land on the moon, those smirks vanished. Von Braun and his team became heroes to many Americans. But for them, the greater reward was seeing their technology used to reach for peace and exploration, not destruction. Years later, some German engineers confessed that Apollo 11's success changed how they viewed themselves and science's role. They realized intellect should serve creation and discovery, not destruction. The story of German scientists mocking American rocketry, only to be awestruck by Apollo 11, is a testament to the power of belief, resources, and collaboration. It's also a reminder that those underestimated can achieve greatness with ambition and perseverance. Above all, it proves that science, when used for humanity's sake, can heal the deepest wounds of history.